There is a mountain in northern Mozambique that looks almost ordinary from a distance, until you realize that something extraordinary is hidden behind its walls. Mount Lico rises dramatically above the surrounding landscape, an isolated mass of ancient rock surrounded by lower ground that has been heavily used and transformed by people. But at the summit, inside a natural bowl formed by the mountain, sits a dense tropical forest. From the ground, the forest was almost impossible to reach. From above, satellite images revealed a dark green canopy enclosed by steep rock faces, almost like a fortress. For years, nobody could say with certainty what was living inside it, how the forest had developed, or whether humans had ever significantly disturbed it. Then conservation biologist Julian Bayliss noticed it while studying satellite imagery. The discovery was not a spectacular building, a lost city, or an ancient ruin. It was simply a patch of forest that seemed remarkably different from everything around it. The lowlands had signs of cultivation, roads, settlement, and human activity, yet the summit forest appeared dense and intact. That contrast was what caught Bayliss's attention. Why would one small forest remain apparently untouched when surrounding landscapes had been altered? The most obvious explanation was also the most difficult to test. Perhaps the forest had been protected not by law, not by fences, and not by human management, but by geography itself. The cliffs around Mount Lico were so steep that reaching the summit required technical climbing. And if almost nobody could get there, perhaps almost nobody had changed it. But a satellite image could only reveal the beginning of the story. To understand what Mount Lico really contained, scientists would have to climb the mountain, cross the rock wall, enter the forest, and examine what was there with their own eyes. Mount Lico is part of a landscape known for isolated mountains called Inselbergs, formations that stand dramatically above surrounding terrain after erosion removes softer rock around them. The mountain rises roughly 700 meters above the plains, but the expedition did not need to climb the entire height vertically. A shorter cliff on one side offered a possible route into the forest, although that route was still approximately 125 meters of near vertical rock. For scientists who were experts in ecology, botany, zoology, soil science, and conservation, this was a serious obstacle because most of them were not climbers. The expedition, therefore, needed specialists who could make the ascent safe enough for the rest of the team. Professional climbers, Jules Lyons and Mike Robertson, prepared the route and installed ropes that could carry people and equipment between the base and the summit. The result was a scientific expedition unlike a normal field survey. It was not a matter of driving a vehicle to the edge of a forest, unloading equipment, and walking inside. Everything had to be carried through a landscape where there were limited options for retreat, limited water, difficult communication, and no conventional rescue system waiting nearby. The team eventually included 28 people from multiple countries and institutions, bringing together scientists, climbers, field specialists, and logistical support. Their mission was not to prove a sensational theory. It was to establish what actually existed inside the forest and determine how valuable the ecosystem might be. Scientists wanted to record plants and animals, collect specimens, study soils, investigate the forest's history, and compare this isolated habitat with more disturbed landscapes. In particular, they wanted to understand whether Mount Lico could act as a scientific baseline. If scientists knew what a forest looked like where direct human disturbance was extremely limited, they could compare that forest with ecosystems affected by agriculture, logging, fire, and other human pressures. That comparison could help separate the effects of climate change from the effects of local disturbance, something that is extremely difficult when every forest has already been altered in some way. The expedition reached Mount Lico in May 2018 after years of preparation. The mountain itself was known locally, but the forest above the cliffs remained largely inaccessible to outside researchers. Reports from the surrounding communities suggest that people had not been visiting the summit forest, and local knowledge did not identify a recent tradition of regular human access. That did not prove that nobody in the distant past had ever reached the summit, and scientists were careful to treat the question as something to investigate rather than something to assume. The first expedition, therefore, had another important purpose: to test the idea of isolation using physical evidence. When the first climbers reached the top, they did not discover a perfectly untouched fantasy world. They found a real forest filled with life, tracks, insects, birds, streams, soil, and signs of natural processes. But they also found something that made the isolation theory even more interesting. There were no obvious signs of large-scale recent clearing or agricultural use across the summit forest. The canopy appeared closed, the forest floor showed little evidence of repeated disturbance, and the surrounding cliffs created a natural barrier between this ecosystem and the cultivated terrain below. The first impressions mattered because scientists were not simply looking for unusual species, they were searching for a natural record. A forest that has experienced little direct human disturbance can provide information about ecological processes that are difficult to observe elsewhere. It can show how vegetation develops when large-scale cutting is absent. It can reveal relationships between predators and prey. It can preserve soil layers that contain evidence from earlier centuries. It can also show whether a species that disappears from disturbed landscapes is still able to survive in an isolated habitat. Yet isolation creates its own uncertainty. A forest may appear untouched from the air while still containing evidence of occasional human visits, selective use, old fires, or abandoned activities. That is why the team did not stop with what could be seen from above. They needed samples, measurements, observations, and time inside the forest. One of the first challenges after reaching the summit was simply finding a place to live. Scientific work requires equipment, food, water, shelter, batteries, sample containers, safety gear, and enough supplies to keep a team functioning. On an ordinary field trip, researchers can often return to a road or village. Mount Lico offered no such convenience. The team had to establish a temporary camp inside the isolated environment, close to a source of water created by seepage from the mountain. That moment captures the strange dual nature of the expedition. The scientists had entered a forest they were excited to study, but they were now becoming part of the environment themselves. Every movement created a small disturbance. Every camp decision could affect the forest. That is why the researchers had to work carefully and efficiently. They were not there to transform the ecosystem, but to record it. Their equipment included traps for small mammals and other vertebrates, butterfly traps, camera traps, soil sampling tools, plant presses, specimen containers, measuring equipment, and technology for documenting the forest. Different experts moved through the same environment, looking at completely different things. A mammal specialist watched for tracks and droppings. A botanist focused on plants and canopy structure. Butterfly experts searched for species that could only be distinguished through detailed examination. Soil scientists looked beneath their feet because the ground itself could contain a record of the forest's history. This is one of the most powerful aspects of a scientific expedition. A forest is never just a collection of trees. It is an interconnected system in which insects, fungi, mammals, birds, plants, microbes, water, carbon, and soil interact constantly. A change in one part can influence another. If the climate becomes warmer or rainfall patterns change, plant communities can shift. If plant communities shift, insects respond. If insects respond, birds and small mammals can change. If human disturbance fragments a habitat, some species disappear while others expand. On Mount Lico, researchers hoped they could study these relationships under conditions where direct human pressure appeared unusually low. The soil became one of the most important parts of the investigation. To a casual visitor, rainforest soil may look like ordinary mud, but scientists can read layers of it almost like pages in a history book. Organic material accumulates over time. Charcoal can preserve evidence of ancient fires. Pollen can reveal which plants were present. Changes in the chemistry of the soil can indicate shifts in vegetation and climate. Tiny fragments of biological material can provide clues about what lived in the forest hundreds or even thousands of years ago. On Mount Lico, scientists dug a deep soil pit to investigate these layers. The work was physically demanding because the team did not simply scrape the surface. They had to reach deeper deposits and document their position carefully. The goal was to establish a timeline for environmental change. How old was the forest? Has fire ever affected it? Has vegetation changed naturally? Had droughts occurred? Could the soil reveal climatic fluctuations that predated modern industrial emissions? These questions were important because modern climate science needs historical context. Today, scientists can measure temperature, rainfall, carbon exchange, vegetation change, and species movement, but modern measurements only cover a relatively short period compared with the lifetime of a forest. To understand whether present conditions are unusual, researchers need evidence from the past. Mount Lico offered an unusual opportunity because the apparent lack of direct human disturbance reduced one major source of interference. If the scientists could reconstruct earlier environmental conditions, they might be able to compare those changes with forests that have been heavily altered. This distinction matters. A forest can lose trees because of logging, agriculture, fire, or climate shifts, and the visible result may be similar even though the cause is different. The more accurately researchers can separate these factors, the better they can predict what forests may do in the future. In that sense, the soil on Mount Lico was not just dirt. It was a long-term environmental archive hidden beneath the trees. While the soil scientists looked downward, the wildlife researchers were looking everywhere. One of the most exciting possibilities was the discovery of species unknown to science. Isolated forests can be important locations for evolutionary research because populations that become separated may develop distinctive characteristics over long periods. Mountaintop forests can act like biological islands. A species living inside one isolated habitat may have limited contact with relatives in forests beyond the surrounding cliffs. Over generations, that separation can create differences in appearance, behavior, genetics, or ecology. It does not mean that every isolated mountain contains an unknown species, but it makes such discoveries more likely. The Mount Lico team placed traps for small vertebrates and set camera traps to detect animals that were difficult to observe directly. They searched under vegetation, around streams, along forest edges, and in the canopy. A small mammal could become scientifically important if careful comparison showed that it differed from known species. The same was true for frogs, reptiles, insects, plants, and other organisms. One of the confirmed discoveries from the expedition was a new butterfly species associated with Mount Lico, later formally described as Aphrodinea lico. The scientific publication established the butterfly as a distinct species, turning what initially looked like a promising field observation into a documented contribution to biological knowledge. That distinction matters because scientists do not declare a species new simply because it looks different in the field. A potential new species must be compared with known relatives, examined using appropriate morphological or genetic evidence, and formally described according to scientific standards. The expedition also produced specimens and observations of other animals that researchers considered potentially new or previously undocumented from the mountain. Some required further study before their status could be confirmed. This uncertainty is part of real science. Discovery is not a dramatic moment when a scientist sees an animal and instantly knows it has never existed in a textbook. Discovery is often followed by months or years of comparison, laboratory work, genetic testing, taxonomic review, and publication. The butterfly discovery was only one part of the story because the mountain contained an entire community rather than one spectacular animal. Researchers encountered frogs, insects, small mammals, birds, plants, and other organisms adapted to the humid forest environment. Some findings were interesting, precisely because they raised questions. A species known from other habitats appeared in a place where researchers did not immediately understand how it had arrived or survived. For example, a frog associated with relatively dry forest environments was recorded on Mount Lico, prompting questions about its distribution and ecological history. The presence of unusual species also created a reminder of how little scientists know about isolated ecosystems. A species may be common in one region, yet absent from surveys simply because nobody has examined a particular habitat carefully enough. Conversely, a population can appear unique because scientists have not yet compared it to distant populations. This is why modern biological surveys are so important. Every specimen becomes part of a larger scientific network. Researchers can compare DNA sequences, museum collections, photographs, calls, measurements, and geographic records. Over time, that information reveals patterns that cannot be seen from a single expedition. The scientists at Mount Lico were therefore building a baseline rather than simply collecting curiosities. If the mountain continues to be monitored, future researchers can return and ask whether the species composition has changed. Has a plant disappeared? Has an invasive species arrived? Has a butterfly expanded its range? Has a stream changed? Have temperatures shifted? Has forest structure responded to drought? Without an initial survey, such changes are much harder to measure. Mount Lico could therefore become valuable, not only because it contains unusual species, but because it gives researchers a reference point against which other forests can be compared. In conservation science, that reference can be priceless. You cannot easily measure how much a system has changed unless you have some understanding of what it looked like before the change began. The expedition also revealed something unexpected that complicated the idea of complete human isolation. Near the source of a stream, the scientists found pottery fragments in partly buried vessels. The discovery raised obvious questions. If the summit forest had been isolated from people, how did pots get there? Were they ancient? Has someone reached the mountain long before modern researchers? Were they associated with a particular cultural tradition? Could the fragments have been carried there naturally or moved by animals, erosion, or later visitors? These were not questions the expedition could answer immediately. The responsible response was to leave significant material in place and involve Mozambican researchers who could investigate its age and cultural context. This is exactly where scientific caution becomes essential. The existence of pottery does not automatically prove a permanent settlement. It does not prove continuous human occupation. It certainly does not erase the evidence that the forest had experienced extremely low recent disturbance, but it does demonstrate why absolute claims about untouched environments require care. A forest can be ecologically intact even if people visited it centuries ago. A mountain can have archaeological traces while still functioning as a remarkably isolated ecosystem. The difference between no human has ever entered and no significant human disturbance has occurred for a very long time is enormous, and scientists must distinguish between those statements. Mount Lico became compelling precisely because the available evidence suggested an unusually intact forest, but the researchers themselves continued investigating the possibility of earlier human contact. That made the discovery more interesting rather than less. The goal was not to protect a perfect myth. The goal was to understand the real history of the place And if the pottery could eventually be dated and identified, it might reveal another layer of the mountain's past, connecting ecological evidence with human history. Another question concerned the animals that appeared to live in a place surrounded by apparently severe barriers. Small insects could perhaps arrive through flight. Birds could cross cliffs, seeds could be carried by wind or animals, but larger ground-dwelling animals seemed more difficult to explain. The researchers observed evidence suggesting that antelope or other mammals used the forest, raising an obvious question. How had they reached the summit? A camera trap could record an animal, but it could not explain its historical path. There are several possible explanations. The cliffs may be less inaccessible than they appear from a distance. There may be routes that humans rarely use, but animals can navigate. Animals could have colonized the summit during periods when access routes were different, then remained there after environmental changes. Young animals may disperse across terrain in ways humans underestimate, or what looks like an isolated ecosystem from one direction may actually be connected through hidden slopes and ledges. This is why physical geography matters so much in ecology. A barrier that is absolute for one species may be meaningless to another. A butterfly can fly around a cliff. A seed can be carried across it. A bird can land on a ridge. A mammal may climb a route invisible from the valley floor. The expedition therefore encouraged scientists to think about Mount Lico not simply as a fortress, but as an island with connections. Its isolation was relative, and its biological history depended on which organisms were capable of crossing the barriers. Over thousands of years, those differences could produce a distinctive community. A few species might arrive only once and establish populations. Others might never reach the mountain. Still others might have existed in the region before the landscape around them changed. Understanding these movements is one of the reasons isolated ecosystems are so valuable for evolutionary biology. The climate change question gave the entire expedition an even larger purpose. Rainforests are often described as carbon stores, but their relationship with climate is more complicated than simply saying that trees absorb carbon dioxide. Forests store carbon in wood, roots, litter, and soil. They exchange carbon with the atmosphere through photosynthesis, respiration, decomposition, and other processes. When climate conditions change, these processes can shift. Higher temperatures, altered rainfall, drought, storms, fires, and changes in plant growth can all affect how much carbon a forest stores and how much it releases. Human disturbance adds another layer. If a forest is logged, burned, or converted to agriculture, carbon can be released rapidly. But scientists want to know what happens to the ecosystem itself under climate change, even when direct land clearing is absent. Mount Lico provides a rare opportunity to investigate that question because the forest appears to have experienced much less direct human interference than surrounding landscapes. By establishing measurements of vegetation, soil carbon, species composition, and environmental conditions, researchers can create a baseline. Future observations can then reveal whether the system changes as the climate changes. The mountain cannot stop global warming, of course, and its forest is not immune to regional climate shifts. But it can help scientists understand what those shifts mean for an ecosystem that has not been heavily modified by modern land use. That distinction may become more important as climate change intensifies. Conservation is not only about protecting forests from cutting. It is also about understanding whether protected ecosystems can continue functioning under conditions that are themselves changing. A forest can be perfectly protected from chainsaws and still face warming temperatures, altered precipitation, new diseases, or changes in species ranges. Mount Lico offers researchers a chance to study those pressures before adding another major variable, widespread land use disturbance. This is why the forest's isolation carries value far beyond the number of new species discovered there. A single new butterfly is scientifically interesting, but a whole ecosystem preserved under unusual conditions can become a natural laboratory. Researchers can study how species interact, how nutrients move through soil, how water travels through the forest, how plants respond to climate variability, and how isolated populations evolve. They can compare Mount Lico with nearby forests that have experienced farming or other forms of human pressure. Differences between those sites can then help answer a practical conservation question. What exactly does human disturbance change? Does it reduce species diversity? Does it alter carbon storage? Does it change soil structure? Does it favor certain insects while eliminating others? Does it increase fire risk? Does it disrupt water systems? These questions are essential because conservation decisions often have to balance human needs with environmental protection. Communities living around forested mountains depend on land for agriculture and rely on forests for water, fuel, food, and other resources. Protecting a mountain, therefore, cannot mean simply drawing a line on a map and ignoring the people who live nearby. Effective conservation has to work with local communities and recognize that landscapes are used for real reasons. The Mount Lico expedition highlighted the value of the summit forest, but it also revealed the broader conservation challenge. The surrounding land was being cultivated, And isolated mountain forests can be vulnerable because they may appear unimportant compared with large lowland areas. Yet these small habitats can contain species found nowhere else and can provide water and ecological services far beyond their size. Protecting them requires evidence, local involvement, long-term planning, and recognition that once a species disappears, its evolutionary history cannot simply be recreated. And there was also a deeply personal element to the expedition for Julian Bayliss. His motivation was not simply scientific curiosity. He was thinking about what the natural world would look like for future generations, including his own daughter. That perspective matters because conservation is ultimately about time. A forest can take centuries to develop, while destruction can occur in years or even days. Species can evolve over millions of years, yet a population can disappear in a single human lifetime. Scientists working in remote habitats often experience this contrast directly. They can spend years documenting a species, only to see its habitat threatened by agriculture, logging, mining, fire, or changing climate. Mount Lico therefore represented something rare, evidence that a small ecosystem had survived largely because geography protected it. The mountain's steep cliffs had done what many conservation programs struggle to accomplish. They had created a barrier, but geography is not a permanent guarantee. Roads can be built. Scientists must document it, understand it, communicate its importance, and work with local authorities and communities to protect it. Otherwise, the knowledge gained from the expedition could become a record of something that no longer exists. The emotional power of Mount Lico comes from that possibility. The team was looking at a forest that appeared to have escaped the intensive pressures affecting many other tropical habitats. They knew that the modern world was approaching even the most remote places. Their research could help explain what was there before the next change arrived. In that sense, every sample, every photograph, every species record, and every soil layer became more than data. They became evidence of what is worth keeping. As the expedition continued, the scientists realized that the real discovery was larger than any single species. They had found an ecosystem that challenged assumptions about accessibility, isolation, and biological knowledge. The forest contained organisms that had not been documented from the mountain before. It preserved a soil record that could potentially reveal environmental history. It contained water sources, tracks, insects, plants, and evidence of complex ecological interactions. It also raised questions about ancient human contact through pottery. The stronger and more defensible story is that the summit forest had remained remarkably isolated and largely undisturbed compared with surrounding landscapes, making it an exceptional place for study. That is already extraordinary. In an era when satellites can map almost every corner of the planet, the idea that a scientifically important forest could remain so poorly explored seems surprising. But modern maps do not mean modern knowledge. A satellite can tell us that trees exist on a mountain. It cannot tell us which species are there, how they interact, what diseases they carry, how old the soil is, or what happened there centuries ago. Those answers still require people to go into the field. Mount Lico is therefore a reminder that discovery has not ended. There are still places where a researcher can step into an ecosystem that has never been carefully surveyed and encounter something that changes scientific understanding. The unknown is not necessarily hidden on another planet. Sometimes it is concealed behind a cliff, beneath a canopy, or inside a landscape that everyone thought had already been mapped. When the expedition finally came down from the mountain, the forest remained behind, almost unchanged by the brief human presence that had just passed through it. The ropes were removed. The temporary camp was dismantled. Soil pits were refilled and the surface restored as carefully as possible. Samples traveled back with the scientists, but the mountain itself returned to silence. That ending is important because the expedition was never meant to become a permanent occupation. The researchers had gone there to learn, not to build. The greatest achievement was not simply reaching the summit, it was creating a scientific record of what existed there. The expedition became evidence that some isolated African mountain forests can still contain organisms and ecological relationships that remain poorly understood. It also demonstrated the value of collaboration. The team included scientists from Mozambique and other countries, professional climbers, universities, museums, and research institutions. Local scientific participation was essential because conservation is strongest when knowledge remains connected to the country where the ecosystem exists. The discoveries belong not to one climber or one celebrity scientist, but to a broader scientific community and, ultimately, to the people and future generations of Mozambique. The confirmed butterfly species associated with Mount Lico became one permanent mark of the expedition. Other potential discoveries required more study. The soil samples continued their journey through laboratories. The biological specimens entered scientific collections where they could be compared with material from other regions. The mountain itself remained a living system rather than a museum. That distinction matters. Scientists can preserve specimens, but they cannot preserve an ecosystem by collecting every species inside it. The only way to keep that living system alive is to protect the habitat. And habitat protection becomes more difficult when the threats are invisible, such as gradual climate change, changing rainfall, rising temperatures, invasive species, and pressures from surrounding land use. The story of Mount Lico therefore reaches far beyond one expedition in Mozambique. It begins with a satellite image and a question. Why is there a dense forest here when everything around it has been altered? It continues with a 125-meter climb up a sheer rock wall, the establishment of a temporary camp, the collection of soil, the setting of traps, the discovery of unfamiliar organisms, and the confirmation of a butterfly species previously unknown to science. But beneath all of those discoveries is a much larger lesson. The planet still contains ecosystems that have not been studied as deeply as we imagine. Remote does not mean unimportant, and small does not mean simple. A forest hidden inside a mountain can contain genetic diversity, evolutionary history, carbon, water, and ecological relationships that have taken centuries or millennia to develop. If that forest disappears, no amount of scientific technology can recreate the exact community that was lost. This is why the phrase lost forest is both powerful and dangerous. The forest was never truly lost to nature. It was always there. What was missing was our understanding of it. Scientists did not create the ecosystem by climbing the mountain. They simply opened a door that geography had kept closed. And what they found was a reminder that the unknown is still part of the modern world. We have satellites, aircraft, drones, DNA sequencing, high-resolution maps, and powerful computers. Yet there are still places where direct observation changes everything. Mount Lico shows what happens when modern science meets an ancient landscape that has been protected by steep rock, distance, and time. The result is not a fantasy world. It is something more valuable. Evidence. Evidence of how forests can survive, how species can become isolated, how climate leaves traces in soil, and how much remains to be discovered before it is too late. Today, Mount Lico stands as one of those places that forces us to reconsider the meaning of the word unexplored. Scientists reached the summit in 2018, but reaching it once does not mean knowing everything that lives there. A 2-week expedition can reveal remarkable species and establish a baseline, yet it can barely scratch the surface of an entire ecosystem. Seasonal changes may reveal animals that were absent during the first visit. Flowering cycles may expose plants that were difficult to identify. Migratory species may appear at different times. Soil organisms may remain almost completely unknown. Microbes, fungi, insects, and parasites can represent entire worlds of biological diversity that field teams cannot catalog in one expedition. Even the species that were collected require years of research before scientists fully understand their relationships. That means the Mount Lico story is not finished. The first expedition was the beginning of a scientific process, rather than the final chapter. Future research could reveal new species, clarify the status of unusual populations, reconstruct the mountain's environmental history, or determine how its ecosystem responds to changing climate conditions. It could also answer questions raised by the pottery discovered near the stream. Perhaps those artifacts belong to a known regional tradition. Perhaps they are much older than expected. Perhaps they reveal that humans occasionally entered the summit long before modern researchers. Any of those outcomes would be scientifically valuable. The strongest discoveries are not always the ones that confirm the original hypothesis. Sometimes, the greatest value comes from finding evidence that forces researchers to change the question. Mount Lico has already done that. It began as a search for a possible untouched rainforest and became a wider investigation into isolation, biodiversity, environmental history, and conservation. They were right because it contained something that may be even more valuable, a living ecosystem that had escaped much of the direct disturbance affecting the landscapes around it. The expedition showed that even in the age of satellites, remote forests can hold biological information that has never been properly recorded. It showed that a new species can still be found, that soil can preserve environmental history, and that a difficult landscape can protect nature in ways human institutions sometimes struggle to achieve. But it also delivered a warning. Isolation is not the same as safety. Climate change does not stop at the edge of a cliff. Atmospheric warming reaches mountain forests. Rainfall patterns can shift. Species can move. Diseases can spread. Human pressure can eventually reach places that once seemed inaccessible. The real challenge now is not simply discovering Mount Lico. It is making sure that knowledge of its value leads to protection rather than exploitation. The scientists came down carrying specimens and data, but the most important thing they left behind was a question for everyone else. What other forests are still out there, hidden behind geography, waiting to be studied before they disappear? There's something almost unsettling about that question, because it means the map of the world is not as complete as it looks. We are surrounded by images of every continent, every mountain range, and every forest canopy. Yet an image can never replace being there. The satellites saw the forest. Julian Bayliss saw the possibility. The climbers saw the cliff. The scientists saw the ecosystem. Each perspective revealed something different. That is how real exploration works. It is not one dramatic moment when someone discovers a place that has never existed in human knowledge. It is a series of observations that slowly turns an unknown landscape into a scientifically understood one. Mount Lico became important because those observations revealed a rare combination of isolation, biodiversity, and conservation value. The mountain itself had existed for far longer than the expedition. The forest had developed without waiting for modern science to name its species. The butterflies had flown without appearing in a database. The trees had grown without being measured. The soil had recorded drought, rain, fire, and vegetation change without anyone reading the record. Then for a brief moment in 2018, a group of people crossed the barrier and began asking questions. What they found did not belong to them. It belonged to the mountain, to Mozambique, and to the wider natural history of the planet. Their job was to document it carefully enough that other people could understand why it mattered. So when you hear the title, Scientists Entered a Hidden Forest, no human had ever explored. The most important word may not be hidden. It may be explored. The scientists did not discover a blank space where nothing was known. They entered a forest that had been visible from above, but largely absent from scientific understanding. They transformed an image into measurements, observations, specimens, and evidence. They confirmed at least one species new to science and uncovered the possibility of many more. They investigated the soil as a record of the past. They raised questions about ancient human activity. They established a baseline that could help future researchers understand climate change and human disturbance. And they showed why remote ecosystems deserve attention even when they appear too small or too difficult to matter. Mount Lico is not valuable because it is mysterious. The mountain reminds us that the natural world still contains surprises, but those surprises are disappearing as quickly as scientists can find them. Somewhere else, another patch of forest may be waiting behind a ridge. Another isolated population may be developing on a mountain. Another species may exist without a scientific name. The question is whether we will reach those places in time to understand them, and whether we will protect them once we do. Mount Lico gives us one answer. Discovery still exists, but discovery only matters when it leads to knowledge, and knowledge only matters when we use it to protect the living world that produced it.